The topic of immigration policy is always relevant to employers, but it's especially top of mind with the new administration and warnings that ICE raids and I-9 audits are imminent. Here's what you need to know to avoid costly fines and even imprisonment. I would argue that the most critical document you will have your new hire sign is the Form I-9. And I say that because it is the form that's required of all employers. It has stringent requirements for being completed properly, and the government assesses hefty fines for non-compliance and errors on this form. So why the scrutiny? This is the form that verifies an employee's identity and their legal authorization to work in the U.S. It's important for you to know that if you don't handle Form I-9 correctly, if the government audits your forms and finds errors, whether it's missing forms, improper documentation, expired records, you could face fines ranging from hundreds to thousands of dollars per violation. And if there's any hint of willful non-compliance, well, then we're talking criminal penalties. Believe it or not, the forms are actually not hard to complete. They're pretty straightforward. The problem is that if managers are not properly trained on how to complete them or to complete them at all, mistakes add up if you're audited. In my 20 years in HR, I have never conducted an initial I-9 audit and not found errors. Never. I just told you compliance is not hard, so let me give you a checklist to follow to make that true for you. Step 1, properly complete the form for all new hires. Make sure the employee fills out Section 1 on their first day, and then you complete Section 2 no later than day 3. When you complete your part, go back and audit every field to confirm the form is complete and accurate. Step 2, check documents carefully. Only accept valid, unexpired documents, except for documents expressly allowed to be expired. The list of acceptable forms is included with every I-9, so make sure you're using that when you're completing the form and auditing the form. Also, remember you must personally view the new hire's physical documents. You cannot accept a copy of the document either on paper or on their phone or electronic device. You must physically see them. One other thing I like to remind employers is that you must accept any documents listed on the acceptable documents list. Some employers try to make it easy on new hires by saying, bring in your driver's license and social security card on your first day. But it's important to know that you can't actually require certain documents for the form. That's actually prohibited by law. Step 3, store and retain I-9s correctly, which leads us to our next section, which is how long do you need to keep these forms? The answer is 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year after termination, whichever is later. So if an employee works for you for 2 years and then quits, you still need to keep their I-9 for another year before shredding it. Now, another common misconception from employers is that if their employee hits their 3rd year of employment, they can destroy the I-9, and that's not true. You do have to retain an I-9 for all current employees. The 3 years from hire is only applicable after termination. It just means that if someone worked for you for 4 years, you can destroy their I-9 when they're terminated. You don't have to wait another year after termination in that case. I used to actually add a little piece of paper to each I-9 when I stored them to indicate what the retention dates were. So I would add the 3 years from hire date right on the form, and then at termination, I would add 1 year from termination date on that form. Then they would be moved to the proper retention folder, indicating when they could be destroyed. Okay, here are your storage options. If you keep them stored in paper, you want to store them separately from the personnel file. This just makes them easier to maintain and audit. If you're storing them electronically, make sure they're secure and easily accessible, and that you have an audit trail of any edits. If you're using E-Verify, that's a completely separate topic that I'm not going to cover in this video, but some states or federal contracts do require the use of E-Verify for all new hires, so be sure you know your compliance requirements there. One other thing I want to mention about electronic or digital onboarding when it comes to the I-9 is that employers do have a legal obligation to confirm that their vendor is compliant with administering this form electronically. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the USCIS, has a whole page dedicated to this topic under Section 10.1. So you should check that out and confirm each item with your onboarding vendor. I also want to give you a quick rundown on the most common mistakes that I see on the Form I-9. Number 1, missing forms completely. Number 2, incomplete sections. Number 3, using the wrong documents. For example, 2 documents from List B instead of 1 document from List B and 1 from List C. Number 4, missing signatures or dates. And number 5, not completing them within 3 days. So with the potential shift in immigration policy, some experts are predicting that worksite enforcement will ramp up, meaning more audits, more investigations, and more penalties. This means that the casual, we'll get to that later, approach to Form I-9 could be a serious risk for your business. My advice is to start with your own I-9 audit to determine your exposure. This also gives you the opportunity to make some corrections that may not save you from penalties, but will help with good faith if you are audited. The bottom line is take Form I-9 seriously, and if you are confused, worried, or overwhelmed about where to begin on knowing if you're doing this right and creating a solid process moving forward, you are not alone. Just don't stay that way. There are a ton of great resources out there to educate you on each step of this process, and you know that your Amplified HR team is here for you if you would prefer not to tackle this alone.